The war on crime will only be won when an attitude of mind and a change of heart takes place in America. It's time, too, that we acknowledge the solution to the crime problem will not be found in the social workers' files, the psychiatrist's notes, or the bureaucrats' budgets. To deny bail to a defendant posing a threat to the community, to make prison sentencing more certain, to end abuses of parole, retribution should be swift and sure for those who prey on the innocent.
Ronald Reagan laying out some of the foundational logic of the American criminal justice system, such as it is. Right now, I'd like to bring in Michelle Alexander, law professor at Ohio State University and author of a really fantastic book called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning.
Michelle, this is a fantastic book, and I really hope that people read it. One of the things I think that's interesting in the book is you talk about your own experience of coming to recognize what the system was doing and what we are in the midst of. And as someone who came to that realization, before we get into the details of what the system looks like and what it does to people, to talk about this political question of how do we go about creating the conditions under which this becomes a political issue, the way that we bridge the gap that right now means that it's consigned to the margins and the communities that are experiencing the criminal justice system, and it's not on the campaign trail in Iowa.
Well, I think it is a huge challenge to put this near the top of the agenda when prisons are out of sight, out of mind, and so many of the kind of mainstream voters who hold so much influence in elections aren't directly affected by the system of mass incarceration, and many of them don't even know people who are. So finding a way to really put this on the agenda is challenging, and I think it requires those of us who do care, those of us who are conscious, to begin to dispel the myths about mass incarceration, the myth that the explosion in our prison population has been driven by crime and crime rates, dispel the myths that people of color are more likely to use or sell drugs than whites. It's not true. To dispel the myths about the reasons for the explosion of our prison population, and to begin to tell the stories of those who have been locked up and permanently locked out of American society, and allow them to share their stories. Until we come to meet these people in the media and through journalism, really meet them, hear them, and understand their stories, I think it will be easy for us to continue to demonize them and to view those populations as largely disposable.
And one of the myths you talked about, I think, is a central one that I want to grapple with for a moment. I mean, people, a whole lot has gone wrong in America in the last 10 years. One of the bright spots, particularly as someone who was raised in New York City, is the dramatic decrease in crime in the country. The crime rate has plummeted markedly. It's something you experience, particularly as a resident of a large city. There is a myth, I think, that the two trends happened. One caused the other, right? We locked a lot of people up, and the crime rate went down. What is your response to that?
Well, as numerous sociologists and criminologists have now shown through their research, there is no clear correlation between the decline in crime rates in recent years and the rise in incarceration rates. In fact, what we've seen is that in states that have not increased their incarceration much, there have been as steep declines in the crime rate as states where there have been enormous escalations in the prison population. There's a lot of debate about what has caused the decline in crime nationwide, but what's clear is that simply building more prisons and filling them does not reduce crime. Unfortunately, what we've seen, though, is in many communities, particularly ghettoized communities of color, is the rise of a virtual police state where hundreds of thousands of people in a given city are stopped, searched, frisked, treated like potential suspects, and enormous numbers are shuttled into prisons and jails, often for, nonviolent, relatively minor, often drug-related offenses, the very sorts of crimes that occur with roughly equal frequency in middle-class white communities or college campuses and go largely ignored. And once you're branded a criminal or felon, you're trapped in a permanent second-class status for life. life.
That branding you talk about in the book and the sort of way it creates a caste system, I want to discuss more about that right after we take this break. Stick around. Michelle Alexander, law professor and author of The New Jim Crow, talking about mass incarceration, its effects on American society and politics. And you said something, you just said something right before we went to break about the way in which your being arrested, prosecuted, pleading out marks you permanently. And I think I want you to talk about this, because one of the things that happens is, even in the discussion about mass incarceration, we talk about the physical structures and the people inside them. And one of the revelations of the book to me was thinking more broadly about how anyone that circles through at any given moment then bears a kind of permanent mark on their record that completely alters what part of society they can be a part of.
Yes, this system is really dependent more on the prison label than on prison time. Once you're branded a criminal or felon, you're relegated to a permanent second-class status for life. You may be stripped of the right to vote, you're deemed ineligible for jury service for the rest of your life, and legally discriminated against in employment, housing, access to education, public benefits. You can be denied even food stamps if you're a drug felon in many states. Many people, I think, have this general sense that, yes, when you get out of prison, life is hard, but, you know, if you apply a certain measure of self-discipline and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can make it. But the reality is that for the rest of your life, you've got to check that box on employment applications asking the dreaded question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? Hundreds of professional licenses are off limits to people who have felony records. In fact, in my state, in Ohio, you can't even get a license to be a barber if you're convicted of a felony. Many people say, well, they could get a job at McDonald's, but actually getting a job at McDonald's is no easy feat if you've been convicted of a felony. You can be barred from public housing even based on an arrest record. People returning home from prison, their families risk eviction if they live in public housing, if they allow their loved one to come home to them. Just basic survival is extraordinarily difficult for millions of people who have been swept into the system through the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, both of which have been concentrated in poor communities of color, which, you know, would have benefited from a massive infusion of investment in education and economic investment and job creation. But instead, we've spent $1 trillion on a drug war and a prison building boom.
Michelle Alexander, you just talked about checking a box on employment applications. I should give a shout out. NAACP and others have been waging a campaign called Ban the Box to actually get employers, large employers, to stop putting that box on applications, because it acts as a very easy screen for these folks that are trying to reintegrate into society, and we're making it as difficult as possible. Michelle Alexander, I would like you to stick around if that's all right, because I want to talk more about this topic with our guests when we come back.